Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a video where I recommend adult fantasy books for YA readers. Quite often I get asked what should I read if I don't really read much adult fantasy and I want to try and start. So I'm going to give you a couple of books to dip your toes into and see if you think that you would like the world building and the writing style. First off, I'm going to recommend one of my absolute favorites, and that is Traitors Blade by Sebastian de Castell. Yes, he does have a young adult series called Spellslinger, and that's the first book, and this is his adult series Traitors Blade and the Greatcoats Quartet in general. I'm recommending this because it has a character that is very engaging and humorous as the protagonist, and he is surrounded by a few other characters. So it's like the Three Musketeers meets a fantasy novel in the sense that there is a lot of banter and there are a couple of key characters that really play off each other quite well. And within 7 pages of starting this book, I was already laughing, and the audiobook is of a really good quality as well. So if you're worried about reading it physically because it might seem intimidating, even though it's not really that long, the rest of the books get a little bit fatter, I would recommend reading it on audiobook because Joe Jameson, the narrator, does an incredible job, and I can't unhear him as Falkio, the main character in here. Also, there's not really a huge magic system to learn, so in that sense it's going to be fairly easy to grasp. It's a very character driven book in the sense that you're just following Falkio and him trying to regain a sense of who he is and what his life is like and what direction it should go after his king was murdered many years ago. And he forms one of the many great coats, so there was more than 140 of them, and we follow 3 of them now after all of them got disbanded. They're kind of like law enforcers and security guards mixed into one. So Falkio on his own is quite intelligent, and he is also brilliant at sword fighting, but he also has this wit about him that he often talks himself in and out of situations, and then at the bare bones of them ends up fighting. So it's more situation based rather than magic system based. So now Falkio and Keston Brasty, his 2 friends, are basically bodyguards, and the situation that they're trying to maintain and guard goes terribly wrong, and that is the premise of the beginning chapter. And then after that it really follows them how they're getting in and out of bad situations, and it leads into more of a magic system later on in the books, in the sense that there is a connection to worldly beings like gods and godlike figures, but it's easier to grasp when you're encountering it. And Sebastian de Castell really builds up the characters and their relationships before he builds up the magic system. So for an adult fantasy, if you're keen to start, Falkio's voice for one is really engaging and easy to get into, and also the characters are really nuanced and really individual in here too. So I would highly recommend this one as a starting point for adult fantasy, also because the series isn't very long, there's only 4 books. My next recommendation is a little bit longer, and it's also longer than 4 books, and it is The Black Prison by Brent Weeks. And this is a book that would probably look quite intimidating because it is a very long one, and you can see the books on the shelf behind me are parts of the series as well, and they're also quite thick. Again, the audiobook, really good and would recommend, but also this is a multiple perspective fantasy, and at least 2 of the characters in here, or 1 or 2 of them, depending on the series and who we end up following throughout it. We start with a young boy named Kip, and he's about 16 years old, so his tone of voice is easy to engage with if you're used to reading young adult, because that's obviously his perspective, and he's very rooted in being a young teenage boy and encountering all of these life-changing things. His country is going to war, he has been swept off his feet by potentially realizing that he can use magic, and there's also a magical school in here. There's also a group of people called the Blackguard, which people go to this school to train to become, and the Blackguard guard the royalty of this world. So it's relatable to a reader of young adult fantasy where there are more institutions and magical schools and that kind of thing. So this is a fairly easy stepping stone to get into. That said, there is a lot more political intrigue in here, and there is a very detailed magic system, but I wouldn't let that discourage you because we learn the magic system through Kip learning it. So don't let the magic system deter you. It is based on color, and you can transmute color into physical matter and use that in any manner that you want to. If you are somebody who likes magic systems, if you like sarcasm, and if you like humor, you'll also like this because Kip's humor is quite self-deprecating, so that's one of the reasons I like him. I know some people don't like him for that reason, and they don't like the way that he interacts with people, but he does grow over the series, so I would recommend sticking with it, because I ended up reading this series and I finished it in 2019, and it became one of my favorite new fantasy series, so that's why I'm recommending it now. I think the writing is descriptive, yes, but the way it's written is also really easy to understand. It doesn't really have purple prose, I guess, so it doesn't really write to be convoluted and to confuse you. It is just candid in the way it conveys things. So again, The Black Prism, would recommend. Please do pick it up if you're thinking about diving into fantasy, because this is one of the key series that I'd love more people to read. Next up is a book that I don't actually have physically on me, but it is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, and this is probably on so many recommendations lists, but it's on here for a reason, and that reason is because it follows Vin, who is 16 years old, and she's a street urchin trying to basically survive, and she gets picked up by this guy named Kelsier, and Kelsier is a leader of this ring, and they want to rebel to get rid of the Lord Ruler. And so the entire premise of the Lord Ruler's position and the Final Empire itself is that basically there was a situation before the book started where it's kind of like Frodo and the ring. So Frodo took the ring to throw into the volcano, and in the Lord of the Rings he succeeded and the heroes won, but in this case the heroes lost, and the bad guy was like, thanks for bringing that to me, killed the hero, and now he is basically reigning over everybody. And so these characters want to rebel against this figure and reclaim themselves and their land, basically. So that's what we're kind of following. There is also a detailed magic system in here where they can control metals, but there is a very specific way that they can do that. It's a very specific rule-based system, and you see it as Vin is trying to learn these ways to interact with metal. So you see it from her perspective and you learn it with her learning it. So it's not a intimidating read for the magic system at all. And Brandon Sanderson's writing, again, is not purple prosy at all, kind of like Brent Weeks. They're both very candid and very easy to read. So if you're wanting a story about a young girl and rebellion and magic thrown into that as well, then I would highly recommend The Final Empire. It is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, but it can also be read kind of like a standalone because it does have an overall story that wraps up in one book, but there are threads that can continue on into a trilogy. So if you're concerned about the fact that it's looking quite thick and there are more than one book, then I would recommend just reading The Final Empire and starting there, because that will give you a sense of Brandon Sanderson's writing, and it will also give you a sense of whether you like the world that he's created and put you into. Next up is a newer book that I read, and it is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames, and I'm recommending this book because it has kind of the traditional fantasy elements in it that make classic fantasy very traditional, I guess. And I mean that in the sense that there is a quest narrative in here, and there is a band that get together and go on this quest, and there are mythical creatures in here as well. So it's a very traditional fantasy, but a very modern take on that, and I really enjoyed that about it. So we follow our main character named Clay, and he is approached by his friend Gabriel, and Gabriel's daughter has been kidnapped and he can't get to her and she is stuck. So he needs to go and get the band back together and go on this quest to save her. And in their prime, this group of characters used to be absolutely amazing, to the point where they are called Saga, their band, and their name is renowned in this world. But they've been out of the mercenary game for many years. They've moved away, they've had kids, they've grown up, and they're not in their 20s anymore. So it's interesting to see them come together and have all of these gripes with each other and with themselves, and just being on this quest, but also wanting to be back at home with their families. I like the banter in here. I think it's easy to read in the sense that there is a quest and it goes from point A to B to C to D. So it's a fairly linear narrative, but it has surprises in the sense that there are magical creatures in here. And so when you encounter them, you don't know how the situation's going to pan out. And I think this author took some awesome risks in those situations. And that's why I want to recommend this, because I thought, oh yeah, these guys will be fine. Nothing's going to happen to them because, you know, they're a band and they're back together and they're supposed to have this quest and they've got this whole narrative arc. No. Not necessarily how it happens. There were surprises woven in here, and I think that that's what made this book really, really enjoyable to me. That and the main character Clay's narrative. I must like sarcastic, sardonic, humorous main characters, because Clay is another one. So that's why I'm recommending Kings of the Wild. It is a little bit more adult because the characters are older and there are no teenage perspectives in here. It's all told from Clay's perspective, and he is very, very much an adult. So it is a bit of a leap if you're used to reading from 16-year-old characters, but I also think that it would be a really beneficial read in terms of getting into adult fantasy, because this was really, really enjoyable and it was funny, it was a lot of fun, and it all wraps up in one book. So if you're wanting an adult fantasy that doesn't require too much commitment, then I would definitely push you to read Kings of the Wild. So Kings of the Wild was going to be my last kind of recommendation for this video, but I also wanted to throw in an honorable mention, and that is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And I'm throwing this in because, yes, I know people talk about it all the time, and there is a reason that people talk about it all the time. I love the way that this is written, and it's so captivating, and I think that if you decide to pick this up, you really won't regret it, because I know people who have picked up this book and they have not been interested in reading prior to reading this book, and then they've devoured it in 3 or 4 days and gone, what else can you recommend me? I need more. So it is a book that can be fairly divisive in the sense of enjoyment, because it is all told from Quoth's perspective, and Quoth is a fairly unreliable narrator, and he's also telling you a story from the perspective of a young boy, so there are things that do get muddied. But regardless, I really liked that it was all from Quoth's perspective. I like him as a character, and I like learning more about him and his journeys and his adventures. And the thing is, it also has a magical university in here. So if you're transitioning from young adult into adult, this is also a very good stepping stone to get into the category of adult. So I would recommend that for this reason. There is a young character again, there is a magical university, and because I liked this so much reading it physically, I went and read the audiobook, and the audiobook is a wonderful experience. So I would recommend reading the audiobook if you are of that inclination as well, if a book this thick really intimidates you. The length of the audiobook might intimidate you a little bit, but it's a beautiful audiobook. The narrator does an absolutely wonderful job. He's one of my favorite narrators ever, Rupert Dagus, I believe, and in between each of the chapters there's a little bit of musical flourish, and it's just wonderful. So I would recommend reading this one. I know people hype it up a lot, and I know people talk about it a lot, but try it out. See if you like it, see if you like the narrative style, and see if you connect with Quoth's voice, because we do start off with him as an adult talking to a chronicler in his tavern, and you wonder when and how he got to that point, but he does talk about his entire story in flashback, and you really get rooted in the flashback story, and it's like that's happening now. So honorable mention definitely goes to Name of the Wind, because it's one of my all-time favorites. But there you go, those are my recommendations for young adult readers. If you want to try your hand at adult fantasy, then these would be on my list of go-tos. So please don't be afraid to dive into adult fantasy. I know it looks intimidating because of the size, but it can really be quite palpable if you pick up the right book for you. So if you've read any of these, or if you're going to now that you've watched this video, please let me know down in the comments. I would love to chat to you as always, but thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.